Rain lashed down in torrents, cold and unforgiving, as Celestine stood alone on the darkened street, mascara streaking down her pale cheeks like smudged ink. The glittering lights of the city seemed so far away now, their hum an empty echo of the life she once commanded. A voice from the past rang through her mind, sharp and relentless. Pride always falls, Celestine, and when it does, it shatters. This was her reckoning, and it began with a single foolish bet. Welcome to an incredible and teachable story. Here, we dive into captivating tales filled with lessons, twists, and heartfelt moments. Get ready to be inspired, moved, and entertained. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share, and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts and keep the conversation going. Let's learn and grow together. Celestine was no ordinary figure in the city's elite circles. She was the storm that swept through them. With wealth that dripped from every polished diamond and couture gown, she carried an arrogance that preceded her, cutting through rooms like a blade. A smile, cold and practiced, graced her lips as she lounged in a velvet armchair, surrounded by friends who echoed her every laugh. "Let's make things interesting," Celestine said, eyes glinting with mischief as she twirled a crystal glass in her manicured fingers. "I'll prove I can bend anyone's will. I'll own a soul, just for fun." Gasps and laughter flared in the room, all eyes on her, as if she'd just set fire to their expectations. Lorcan had a face that spoke of better days, a chiseled jaw beneath the stubble and deep-set eyes that held stories no one cared to ask about. He painted murals on cracked alley walls, each stroke a silent plea against the indifference that surrounded him. Though life had stripped him of comfort, it hadn't robbed him of dignity. Celestine found him on a day when rain threatened, but didn't dare to fall. Stepping from her sleek black car, her shadow swallowed the alley's light as she approached. "You," she said, voice laced with the kind of authority that wasn't meant to be questioned. Lorcan turned, gaze steady and unyielding. There in that alley, an unspoken agreement passed between them. She offered money in exchange for a month of his submission, and after a heartbeat he nodded. The deal was struck. Their fate sealed. What do you think will happen when Celestine's plans go wrong? Stay tuned, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories. The deal had been struck in the dim light of the alley, a silent pact sealed not just by desperation but by an unseen twist of fate. Celestine had swept back into her pristine world, triumph gleaming in her eyes as she planned her first act. That evening she sat at her marble-topped vanity, gilded mirrors reflecting the cityscape, and whispered to herself, "Tomorrow begins my game." Dawn found Lorcan at the iron gates of her mansion, an imposing figure against the gold-leafed grandeur. The guards glanced at him, skepticism plain on their faces, but Celestine's word was law. Ushered inside, Lorcan took in the surroundings, luxury layered over more luxury, as though wealth itself had no end. "Fetch my coffee," Celestine said with a smirk, watching him from the top of the grand staircase, her friends perched behind her like eager spectators. He moved without a word, steps measured, eyes casting fleeting glances at the immaculate art that adorned the halls. The days followed a similar pattern, errands, commands, demands, each a showcase of Celestine's control. She relished the power, the way he obeyed without protest. Yet Lorcan was no mere pawn. Subtle defiance crept into the smallest moments. A knowing glance as he handed her a book, a slight pause before responding to her orders, a whispered phrase, "Are you sure, miss?" that made her falter for half a heartbeat. The household staff, initially wary of him, began to notice. One evening, as Celestine threw a dinner party to flaunt her human accessory, Lorcan quietly helped a server steady a tray, saving them from her inevitable wrath. The server's whispered thank you rippled through the kitchen, sparking quiet conversations. Each act of kindness was a thread, weaving into something unseen. The staff, once silent observers of Celestine's excesses, now watched her with eyes that shifted from awe to something closer to pity. Lorcan's presence was more than tolerated. It began to challenge the very atmosphere of the mansion. Celestine noticed. She saw it in the way her maid, Delphine, now met her gaze with the smallest glimmer of defiance, in how the butler's polite nod held a trace of something unreadable. Lorcan's influence was subtle, but it was there, like a shadow stretching longer at dusk. She ignored it, told herself it was inconsequential. After all, she was in control, or so she believed. But change has a way of moving silently, building like a storm just beyond the horizon. It began with a small crack, barely noticeable, but enough to change the course of everything. Celestine, for the first time in years, sat alone in her vast sitting room, the evening stretching out in front of her like an empty canvas. Her fingers trembled slightly as she brushed a stray lock of hair from her face, the weight of the silence settling like dust around her. Her eyes, usually sharp and cold, softened as they focused on the distant city skyline. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't thinking about wealth, power, or the next social maneuver. Lorcan had been gone all day, as per usual, handling another trivial task. Perhaps fetching something, perhaps simply existing in her space, a mere presence that now seemed to shift her world ever so slightly. When he returned, however, it wasn't with the same obedience she had grown accustomed to. He lingered at the doorway of the sitting room, eyes thoughtful. "You know, you never really talk about yourself," he said, voice calm, without the usual mockery or sarcasm. "What's behind all this?" His gaze moved around the room, sweeping over the polished furniture, the designer pieces that adorned every corner. Celestine stilled, caught off guard by the question. She had built walls higher than any fortress, and no one had dared ask her such things. Her instincts screamed to dismiss him, to send him away with a cutting remark. Yet something about his presence, steady and patient, made her hesitate. So instead, she turned her face toward him and said the first thing that came to mind, though she hadn't intended to share it. "My father," she murmured, almost absently. "He always told me I wasn't enough. Nothing was ever good enough." Lorcan, ever observant, saw the vulnerability in her eyes, flickering like a candle just before the wind could blow it out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, as if giving her space to process her own words, Lorcan leaned against the doorframe, his posture casual but attentive. "It's funny how people forget, isn't it?" he said after a long pause, his voice softer now, more reflective. "They forget that what you see on the outside isn't the whole story." Celestine looked at him, intrigued despite herself. "What do you mean?" He glanced down for a moment, choosing his words with care. "I used to have everything. An art gallery, friends who were supposed to be family." His eyes darkened, and Celestine could sense a story waiting to spill, a bitterness that lingered in the air. But it all fell apart when Xavian, my best friend, betrayed me. He took everything I worked for right from under my nose, and I let him destroy me. She blinked, surprised by the rawness in his confession. "That's tragic," she said, her voice quieter than usual, and for the first time in their strange, tense dynamic, Celestine felt a genuine pang of empathy. "Yeah," Lorcan replied, his smile more of a shadow than a thing of joy. "But what's more tragic is how long it took me to pick up the pieces. How long it took me to see that people don't always have your best interests at heart, even if you trust them completely." Celestine's thoughts began to drift, the sharp edges of her world softening ever so slightly as she processed his words. She realized then that she didn't just see him as a servant anymore. He was more like a reflection of her own struggles, her own doubts. They were more alike than she had ever wanted to admit. But just as she began to form a bond with Lorcan, something happened that threatened to shatter this fragile connection. It started with a simple message from Ephra, delivered to Celestine's phone, a message that, in a moment of curiosity, she opened. The words hit her like a slap across the face. Isolde and Xavian spotted together again, in the city, holding hands. Celestine's breath caught in her throat and a cold rage stirred in her chest. Isolde, her former fiancée, the woman who had once filled the hollow spaces of Celestine's life with false promises, had moved on. And not just moved on, but with Xavian, the very man who had once shared her heart. Her ex-fiancé was dating the man who had betrayed Lorcan, and who had once been a part of Celestine's own past, now tangled in a new, messy love affair. Her grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white, and the room seemed to grow colder with each passing second. A wave of jealousy surged through her, bitter, hot, and unstoppable. Why? Why did it have to be this way? Why did Lorcan have to see her, of all people, moving forward with the man who had taken everything from him? Without realizing, Celestine stood up, her body trembling with the intensity of her emotions. She paced the room, her mind racing. "I will not let this happen," she muttered to herself. She felt her old instincts kicking in, the drive to win, to be the one in control, to never be left behind. Lorcan entered the room just then, his expression calm but alert. "Is everything okay?" he asked, noticing her sudden agitation. For a brief moment, Celestine's composure cracked. Her voice, though steady, betrayed the fury beneath the surface. "Isolde? She's with him." "Xavian," she said, her teeth gritting. "Why does it always have to be this way? Why does he always get what he wants?" Lorcan's eyes softened with understanding, but there was something else there. An edge of caution, perhaps. "Celestine," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned from pain. "Sometimes the things we lose, we weren't meant to have." The words hung between them like a question neither of them could answer. And for the first time, Celestine's carefully constructed walls began to shift. Not with the thrill of power, but with the vulnerability of a woman who had, for the first time, lost control over something that mattered. And in that moment, as her past collided with her present, the foundation of everything she had once believed about herself began to tremble. Would she let it all fall apart, or would she grasp at whatever fragments of control remained? What will happen next? Will Celestine's jealousy consume her, or will Lorcan show her the way out? Leave a comment. Stay tuned, and don't forget to like and subscribe. As Celestine continued to navigate the complex and ever-shifting landscape of her world, she began to realize something strange was happening. Her carefully constructed walls, built over years of manipulation and control, had been cracking little by little in the presence of Lorcan. And though she had spent a lifetime ignoring the fragility of human connection, there was something undeniable about the way his quiet strength and kindness had seeped into her life, like a quiet tide eroding the stone walls she had so meticulously built. But not everyone around her was pleased with this transformation. Her friends, those who had once been her loyal circle of equally arrogant and wealthy companions, began to notice the subtle shift in Celestine's behaviour. They had always admired her for her unshakable control, her ability to command any room with just a look, but now there was a subtle softness in her. She had begun to care about someone other than herself, and that, to them, was a dangerous vulnerability. It wasn't long before whispers started to circulate. They were jealous, perhaps, of the way Lorcan had managed to earn a place in Celestine's life, to break through the walls that had always kept people at arm's length. They didn't understand it, didn't like it, and certainly didn't want their queen to be dethroned by a homeless man, no matter how charming he might be. So they plotted. It all began with a party, one of Celestine's signature soirees, a glamorous gathering full of the rich, powerful and pretentious. But this time her friends had something different in mind. They secretly planned to humiliate Lorcan, to expose him as nothing more than a pawn in Celestine's twisted game. The night of the party arrived, and as always, Celestine took centre stage, dazzling her guests with her beauty, her charm, and her seemingly endless supply of wealth. But there was an underlying tension in the air, an edge to her usual confidence, a nervousness she couldn't quite shake off. Lorcan arrived quietly, looking effortlessly out of place in the extravagant ballroom filled with laughter and champagne. He was in a simple suit, no designer labels, his art world background still evident in the way he carried himself, graceful yet grounded. Celestine, caught in the spotlight, felt a momentary pang of pride as she watched him interact with a few of her guests, but it was then that she saw the glint of mischief in her friends' eyes, the way they exchanged knowing glances. The evening was set to go as usual, drinks, games, dancing, but her friends had prepared a cruel surprise. "Why don't we play a game?" Evelyn, one of Celestine's closest confidants, suggested sweetly, though her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Let's see how well we know our hosts." The game at first glance seemed harmless enough, questions about Celestine's favourite designer, her childhood memories, her most ridiculous habits, but when the topic shifted to Lorcan, the mood in the room took a sharp turn. "Lorcan," Evelyn called, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Tell us, how does it feel to be bought for a month?" The guests chuckled, some nervously, others more openly mocking. "Celestine must have a few interesting requests. Is it a lot of fun to play dress-up for her?" The laughter intensified, but Celestine felt something shift inside her. She could see Lorcan standing there, poised and calm, the slightest flicker of amusement on his face, as if the entire situation was a mere game to him too. But her friends weren't finished yet. They turned the game into a cruel spectacle, each question designed to embarrass him further, to force him to reveal something humiliating. And then something unexpected happened. Lorcan didn't flinch. He didn't shrink away or try to defend himself. Instead, he smiled, a warm, genuine smile that seemed to make the room quiet for just a moment. "Actually, Celestine's been very generous," he said with a hint of humour in his voice. "She's allowed me to experience things I never thought I would. For example," he added with a glint in his eye, "I've never been to a party quite like this." The guests froze for a split second, unsure of how to respond. Lorcan's charm was disarming, his confidence impossible to ignore. But it wasn't just his words, it was the way he carried himself, as if the sneers and mockery from her friends didn't even touch him. He had become the one in control, turning their cruel game into a laughable spectacle. As the evening wore on, Lorcan's presence seemed to transform the atmosphere. He effortlessly engaged with Celestine's guests, like charming them with his wit and intelligence, and subtly exposing their own pretensions and insecurities. It wasn't long before even Celestine's most loyal friends began to shift in their seats, unsure of how to handle this unexpected turn of events. In the end, it wasn't Lorcan who had been humiliated. It was them. The night drew to a close, and the guests began to leave, their chatter buzzing in the background. But Celestine remained standing by the door, watching Lorcan as he said his goodbyes to the last few guests. There was a strange feeling settling in her chest, a mixture of guilt, admiration, and something she couldn't quite name. She had watched him with pride earlier, but now, in the quiet aftermath of the evening, the weight of what had happened sank in. Her friends had tried to humiliate him, to break him down, and yet in the end he had turned it all around. He had outsmarted them, outclassed them, and left her friends with nothing but their own discomfort. Celestine's mind was in turmoil. She knew she should feel triumphant. After all, she had won, hadn't she? She had orchestrated the whole evening, showing off Lorcan to prove how easy it was for her to control him. But now it felt different. She felt small, and her pride seemed meaningless in the face of what just happened. Lorcan approached her, his demeanour relaxed, as if he hadn't just endured the mockery of her closest companions. "Well, that was fun," he said with a grin. "They're a lively bunch." Celestine couldn't help but smile, but there was something bittersweet about it. "You handled them well," she said softly, her voice betraying the vulnerability she had tried so hard to hide. "I didn't think you would." Lorcan's eyes softened, and for a moment Celestine saw a flicker of something genuine in him, a kind of forgiveness, perhaps. "I think they underestimated me," he said simply. "But you gave me the chance to prove them wrong." Her heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in a long while, Celestine felt something stir within her, something she couldn't dismiss. It wasn't just admiration, it was a deeper, more complex feeling, one that threatened to undo all the control she had worked so hard to maintain. Do you think Celestine will finally admit her true feelings, or will her pride ruin everything? Stay tuned to find out, and don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments down below. The morning after the party, a strange silence hung in the air between Celestine and Lorcan. It was as though something had shifted overnight, something irreversible. They moved through the house, sharing little more than fleeting glances, as if the weight of last night's events had carved an invisible chasm between them. Despite her attempts to maintain control, Celestine could feel the walls she had so carefully constructed begin to crumble. She had always believed she was untouchable, that no one could ever break through her armor, but in the stillness of that morning, she realized that Lorcan had done something she never expected. He had gotten inside. Celestine tried to dismiss the gnawing feeling in her chest, but it wouldn't go away. It was the guilt, the realization that she had used him for sport, for nothing more than her own twisted amusement. She had turned him into a pawn in a game she didn't even care about, a bet with her friends that had cost her far more than she was willing to admit. The problem was, she had started to care about him, genuinely care in a way that frightened her. But before she could do anything about it, it all came crashing down. It started with the newspaper. As Celestine sipped her morning coffee, scanning the pages of the daily tabloid in her oversized mansion, her eyes froze on a headline that would change everything. Heiress, Celestine wins bet, but at what cost? Homeless man bought for a month in shocking power play. The article went on to detail the bet she had made with her friends, painting her as the spoiled, entitled rich girl she had always been. Her world, so carefully curated and protected, suddenly unravelled in front of her eyes. Every word stung, every detail a harsh reminder of what she had done. The scandal was all over the press, and within hours it had spread like wildfire. Her father, Alaric, who had always been the driving force behind Celestine's success, the one who had moulded her into the perfect heiress, was furious. He called her into his office, his eyes cold and calculating as always. His voice, usually so steady and composed, trembled with barely contained rage. "You've ruined everything," he spat, his voice thick with anger. "I worked my whole life to build this family's reputation, and you've just destroyed it with one reckless stunt." Celestine's heart pounded in her chest as he raged at her, blaming her for tarnishing their name, for bringing shame to the legacy he had carefully crafted. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he continued. "You've brought us into the spotlight for all the wrong reasons, and now I've had to freeze your trust fund. Your inheritance? Gone. I will not allow someone so reckless to squander everything we've worked for." It was as if the ground beneath her had given way, and Celestine was falling into a void she couldn't escape. Her wealth, her status, the very thing she had built her identity around, was slipping through her fingers. She could hear her father's harsh words echoing in her mind, but they didn't make sense. They couldn't. She had been untouchable. She had been the one everyone envied. And now she was a pariah. But that wasn't the worst of it. Her friends, the same people who had once adored her, who had stood by her through every outrageous stunt, were gone. Gone without a word, without a second glance. At first she thought they were just busy, distracted by their own affairs, but it didn't take long for her to realise the truth. They had abandoned her. Completely. Not a single message, not a single call. Her closest confidants, the ones who had plotted alongside her in every trivial scheme, were nowhere to be found. And then she remembered the party. Had they been using her all along too? Had they enjoyed the spectacle only to drop her when the heat was turned up too high? Celestine sat in her expansive, empty living room, staring at the silence around her, and for the first time she felt it, the loneliness she had always ignored, the isolation she had fought to keep at bay. Lorcan had left too. It wasn't an obvious departure. He didn't announce it with grand gestures or make a scene. Instead, he had quietly packed his few belongings in the middle of the night and slipped away without a word. Celestine had woken up to find him gone, and though she had tried to call him, tried to reach him, it was as if he had disappeared into thin air. "Things are heating up. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next twist." Celestine's world had been turned upside down, and as the dust settled around her, she realised the weight of her actions. The bet, the manipulation, the cruelty, all of it had led her here. She had lost everything, but perhaps even worse. She had lost the one thing she hadn't known she needed until it was gone. Lorcan. And now, as the press continued to pour salt into her wounds and her father disowned her, was forced to face a truth that had been hiding just beneath the surface. She was alone, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't sure how to fix it. But there was one thing she knew for certain. Lorcan wasn't the one who had broken her. She had done that all on her own. Lorcan woke up in a modest studio apartment, the air thick with the smell of fresh paint and wood polish. The room, which had once felt cramped and impersonal, now seemed to carry a certain warmth, a sense of new beginnings. After all, this was his first real step toward redemption, toward rebuilding a life he had almost lost to bitterness and regret. He had used the money Celestine had paid him to escape the streets, to start over. The funds had been generous, more than enough to give him the chance he had always dreamed of, to reclaim his art, the one thing in life that had never let him down. He had always been an artist, but for so long it had felt like a distant dream, one that was buried beneath the weight of betrayal and the scars of a failed relationship. His first purchase had been simple: supplies, easels, brushes, canvases, and paints. He wanted to paint not for fame or fortune, but for himself. He had poured his heart into those first few strokes, using the canvas as an escape from the chaos of his past. But it was more than just the art. In the small studio, surrounded by empty walls and a life he had pieced together from fragments of his former self, Lorcan began to rediscover a sense of peace. The stress, the anger, everything that had once consumed him slowly faded into the background. It was as though with every brushstroke, he was shedding the skin of the man who had been exploited, the man who had been manipulated. It was here that he met Callista. She wasn't like the other people who had come and gone in his life. Callista was an art critic, but unlike the jaded critics Lorcan had encountered before, she had an eye for true talent. She saw something in Lorcan's work that he hadn't even recognized himself: the raw emotion, the vulnerability, the honesty that spilled from the canvas. And in return, she didn't just praise his art, she believed in him. At first, it had been a professional connection. She attended one of his small exhibitions, offering encouragement and insight. But soon, their relationship deepened. Their shared love for art became the foundation of a growing friendship, and as time passed, that friendship blossomed into something more. Lorcan's feelings for Callista were not instantaneous. They were a slow, steady build. She was kind, intelligent, and passionate about the same things he was. They spent hours discussing art, philosophy, and dreams they had never shared with anyone else. She pushed him to pursue his passion, to showcase his work in a way he had never dared to before. "You don't paint for anyone else, Lorcan," she told him one evening as they sipped wine in the quiet of his studio. "You paint because it's who you are. You deserve to have the world see that." Her belief in him reignited something deep inside Lorcan, something he had thought had died in the dark corners of his heart. For the first time in a long while, he felt alive. He poured himself into his work, creating masterpieces that reflected the depth of his soul. His art caught the attention of collectors, and soon his small studio became a haven for those who sought something authentic, something that spoke to the rawness of the human experience. And as Lorcan's work flourished, so did his bond with Callista. She wasn't just a critic anymore. She was his partner, his muse, and most importantly, the woman who helped him believe in love again. But the happiness that had begun to fill Lorcan's heart was soon met with an unexpected complication. One evening, as he was preparing for an upcoming exhibition, he received an email that he had never expected to see in his inbox. The subject line was simple: "I need to talk." It was from Celestine. Lorcan stared at the screen for a long time, unsure of how to react. It had been months since he had left her mansion, since he had walked away from the life she had tried to force upon him. He had buried his resentment deep inside, but it was impossible to forget the way she had treated him, the way she had used him as a tool in her reckless game. Still, curiosity gnawed at him. What did Celestine want now? He clicked open the message. "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need to explain. I've been thinking about what I did, and I want to make things right." Lorcan let out a bitter laugh as he read the words. Make things right? How could she possibly make things right after everything that had happened? But there was more. The email continued. "I've realized that I hurt you more than I ever intended, and I regret it deeply. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I hope we can talk. I need to make amends, Lorcan." For a moment, Lorcan considered responding. Part of him wanted to tell her how he felt, wanted to let her know how much she had shattered his trust. But as he sat there, staring at the screen, his thoughts were interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. He opened it to find Callista standing there, her warm smile lighting up the dimly lit hallway. "Hey," she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Everything okay?" Lorcan hesitated for a moment, his eyes flicking between the screen and Callista's concerned face. Then he made his decision. "No," he replied, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "It's not, but I'm done with her. I'm done with Celestine." Callista nodded, her expression soft but understanding. "You don't need to explain it to me, Lorcan. You've been through enough." And with that, the decision was made. Lorcan deleted the email as though erasing a part of his past he no longer needed. But as he closed the laptop, he couldn't help but wonder, was he really ready to let go of everything? Was he ready to let Celestine fade into the distance, even as she reached out for redemption? Lorcan's heart was no longer burdened by the past, but a small part of him still wondered if there would ever be a moment when he could forgive her. He didn't have the answer yet, but for now he had something far more precious: his art, his new life, and Callista, the woman who had helped him find his way out of the darkness. It was a rainy afternoon when Celestine realized the full weight of what her life had become. Her once grand mansion was now a hollow shell, its walls echoing with the absence of laughter, the absence of friends. Her world, once filled with luxurious dinners and extravagant parties, had turned into an endless cycle of empty days and lonely nights. The scandal had destroyed everything. Her father had cut her off, and the people she had once surrounded herself with, her circle of privileged, superficial friends, had all vanished. They had abandoned her when she had become a liability, as they had done with anyone or anything they deemed unworthy. Celestine, for the first time, was forced to confront her own loneliness. But it wasn't just loneliness. It was a deeper, more soul-crushing realization. She had been a puppet to her own desires, a puppet to a life that wasn't hers to begin with. She had lived for the applause, for the accolades, for the empty promises of a life built on wealth. But now, with everything gone, she had nothing left but the guilt that weighed heavily on her chest. Her money was gone, and with it, her sense of identity. She no longer had the luxury of sitting idle in her penthouse suite, indulging in the comforts she had once taken for granted. She needed to do something, but she didn't know what. That's when she saw the advertisement. Volunteers needed. Help us change lives. It was for a local homeless shelter, a place where people who had lost everything could find a moment of reprieve. The words seemed to speak to her, cutting through her confusion. For reasons she couldn't explain, Celestine found herself standing at the door of the shelter that very afternoon, ready to take her first real step toward redemption, though she wasn't sure if she even believed in redemption. Her first day was humbling. Celestine had never truly worked for anything in her life. Everything had been handed to her, from her expensive education to the privileges of her family name. Now, here she was, sorting through old clothes, distributing meals, and talking to people whose lives had been torn apart in ways she had never imagined. She found herself listening to their stories, their struggles, their dreams, their shattered hopes, and for the first time, Celestine saw a world beyond her own. The people at the shelter didn't know her history. They didn't care who she was or where she came from. To them, she was just another volunteer, doing her part to make the world a little brighter. And in their simplicity, their kindness, Celestine found something she hadn't realized she had been searching for: peace. The days at the shelter became routine, but they were also transformative. She started to look forward to the small moments, the conversations with the regulars, the laughter that filled the space when someone told a silly joke, the feeling of knowing she had made a difference, no matter how small. Celestine began to realize that this was what real happiness looked like. It wasn't in the material things. It wasn't in the crowds of people who applauded her. It was in the quiet moments of human connection, in the giving of herself without expectation of return. Yet, despite the progress she was making, there was still one thing, one person she couldn't seem to shake from her mind: Lorcan. Her thoughts about him were conflicted. On one hand, she knew she had hurt him beyond measure. She had used him for her own amusement, played a dangerous game with his heart, and manipulated his kindness to fuel her own sense of superiority. But on the other hand, she couldn't help but feel proud of him, proud of how far he had come. He had turned his life around in ways she hadn't imagined possible. He had not only survived the cruelty she had subjected him to, but he had thrived. His success, his art, his relationship with Callista, everything he had built, he had done on his own, without the help of someone like her. It stung, but it also stirred something within her, something she had buried deep: admiration. One evening, as Celestine was helping serve food at the shelter, one of the volunteers mentioned a new art exhibit opening in the city. Lorcan's art is featured, the volunteer said casually, as if it was just another fact in a world full of ordinary details. But for Celestine, the words hit her like a thunderclap. Lorcan, his work was now on display for the world to see, his talent no longer hidden in the shadows. She knew she had to go. She needed to see it for herself. The art exhibit was a grand affair, the kind of event Celestine had once attended regularly, but this time it felt different. The walls were adorned with Lorcan's work, bold, raw, and unapologetically honest. The painting spoke of pain, of rebirth, of hope. It was a world she had never known, a world that seemed to pulse with life in a way her former existence never had. And then she saw him. Lorcan stood across the room, talking animatedly with a group of admirers. He was different, more at ease, more confident, and undeniably more handsome than she remembered. The artist who had once been a pawn in her cruel game was now a man who commanded respect. The very air around him seemed to hum with a quiet strength. Her heart twisted as she watched him. She wanted to approach, to apologize, to tell him everything she had realized. But the words seemed to die in her throat. She wasn't sure if he would even want to hear them. After everything she had done, did she even deserve his forgiveness? As if sensing her presence, Lorcan's eyes met hers from across the room. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, as if neither knew what to say. Finally, he excused himself from the group and made his way toward her. Celestine's heart raced. She wasn't sure whether she was afraid or relieved, but there was no turning back now. "Celestine," Lorcan said quietly, his voice soft but firm. There was no bitterness in his words, no anger, just an underlying sadness that seemed to speak volumes. "I see you're doing well," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry," she added, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I know I don't have the right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I've changed. I've been trying to change." Lorcan regarded her for a moment, his gaze unreadable. Finally, he nodded slowly. "I can see that," he said. "I'm glad you're finding your way." But then, as his eyes lingered on her, something shifted. A small smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I'm proud of you, Celestine. You're doing something real now." Celestine blinked, unsure of what to say. But before she could speak, Lorcan turned and walked away, back into the crowd, leaving her standing there, caught between the past and the future. Will Lorcan forgive Celestine? Comment your thoughts below. As Celestine stood alone in the art gallery, watching Lorcan disappear into the sea of people, she realized that redemption wasn't something that could be earned in a single moment. It wasn't about words or apologies. It was about the actions that followed, about proving to the world and to herself that she had changed. And while Celestine wasn't sure if she and Lorcan would ever be able to move past the mistakes of their shared history, she knew one thing for sure: she was no longer the person she had once been. Her journey had only just begun. Celestine's journey to redemption had not been easy. Every step had been painful. Every moment of self-reflection felt like peeling away layers of a life she had once treasured, but now saw as hollow. Still, there was one last thing left for her to do, one final confrontation that had the potential to bring everything full circle. It had been weeks since the art exhibit. Weeks since she had seen Lorcan, the man she had once used, the man who had somehow managed to outgrow the pain she had caused him. He was thriving now. His art, his relationship with Callista, and his newfound peace were all testaments to his strength. Celestine, on the other hand, was still fighting for a life that mattered. She knew she owed him more than just an apology. She owed him a truth. She had spent the days leading up to this moment questioning how she would face him. Could she undo the damage? Was there even a way to make things right? She wasn't sure, but one thing was clear. She couldn't leave the past lingering, like an open wound that never healed. On a crisp afternoon, Celestine found herself standing outside Lorcan's studio. She had asked him for a meeting, though she wasn't sure what kind of reception she would receive. The studio was quiet, tucked away in a corner of the city that seemed far removed from the life she had once known. As she approached the door, her hands trembled. Before she could knock, Lorcan appeared. He looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Celestine," he said, his voice soft but steady, "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," she replied, her heart pounding, "but I needed to see you." to talk. Lorcan stepped aside, wordlessly inviting her in. The warmth of the studio contrasted with the cold air outside, and for a brief moment, Celestine felt a sense of peace that she hadn't known in years. She followed him to a corner where a few of his paintings were displayed, each one a masterpiece, full of emotion, raw and powerful. They sat in silence for a moment before Celestine spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been thinking about everything, about us, and I know I've hurt you in ways I'll never be able to take back." Lorcan looked at her, his expression softening. "You've changed, Celestine," he said quietly. "I can see it, but some things are harder to move past." A knot tightened in Celestine's chest. She wasn't sure what she had expected from this conversation, but it wasn't this. Wasn't the calm acceptance of her apology, coupled with the understanding that there was still distance between them. She had hoped for something more, something that could somehow undo the damage she had caused. But the truth was, Celestine had to accept that the damage couldn't be undone. It had been too deep, too pervasive. Lorcan was no longer the man she had tried to control, and he didn't need her to heal. He had found his own way. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time with more conviction. "I'm sorry for everything. For the bet. For using you. For making you believe that you were just a pawn in my game." Lorcan nodded, a small but sincere smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't have to keep apologizing, Celestine. I've forgiven you, but I've moved on, and I've found something real, something good." Celestine swallowed hard, her eyes misting over. "I see that, and I'm glad. I really am." There was a long pause, a moment where neither of them knew what to say next. Finally, Celestine stood and placed her hands in her pockets, taking in a deep breath. "I never meant to hurt you," she said, more to herself than to him. "I thought I could control everything, that I could buy my way into happiness, but I was wrong." Lorcan didn't respond. He didn't need to. They both knew the truth now, the truth of what had happened, of how far Celestine had fallen, and how she was starting to rise again. But just as Celestine was about to turn and leave, the phone in her pocket vibrated. She pulled it out to see a news alert flash across the screen, and her blood ran cold. Breaking. Alaric de Verrees, CEO of de Verrees Enterprises, implicated in financial scandal. Family assets frozen. Trust funds seized. Her father, Alaric, the man who had shaped her life, who had pushed her to be the person she once was now the centre of a massive scandal. The trust funds she had once relied on, the wealth that had been her crutch, was gone. The Devereux name, tarnished beyond repair. She could feel the weight of it all crashing down on her. In that moment, it was as if the universe had delivered its final blow to everything she had ever known. Her father's sins had now become her own. But as Celestine stood there, her heart pounding, she realised something. This was karma. She had spent so much of her life manipulating others, using her wealth and influence to get what she wanted. But now it was all slipping through her fingers, as her father's greed had finally caught up with them both. There was no escaping it. There was no way to buy her way out of this. And for the first time in years, Celestine wasn't angry. She wasn't desperate. She was calm. "I guess this is it," she said quietly, staring at the phone screen. "The end of the Devereux empire." Lorcan's voice cut through the silence. "Maybe it's the beginning of something new." Celestine turned to face him, a small, almost imperceptible smile tugging at her lips. He was right. Her world had crumbled, but it wasn't the end. It was the start of something else. She had already begun to rebuild, and it would take time, but she would keep going. In the weeks that followed, Celestine's transformation took a deeper, more meaningful turn. She didn't run from the fallout of her father's scandal. Instead, she faced it head-on. With the Devereux name now in ruins, she became a spokesperson for change, speaking out against the very power games that had once defined her life. She used her platform to support those who had been hurt by the same system of privilege and manipulation she had once been a part of. She began working with organisations dedicated to helping those who had fallen through the cracks, the homeless, the abandoned, the overlooked. She visited shelters, volunteered her time, and used her story to shed light on the importance of compassion and empathy. And as time went on, people started to notice the change in Celestine. She wasn't the arrogant socialite anymore. She was someone different, someone real, and maybe, just maybe, She had found the purpose she had been searching for all along. As the months passed, Lorcan's artistic journey continued to flourish. What had started as a small studio, a humble space filled with the remnants of his past struggles, had now transformed into a bustling creative hub. His paintings, once born out of pain and betrayal, now radiated hope, resilience, and beauty. They spoke not just of his journey, but of the universal human experience, the raw emotions of loss, love, and redemption. Lorcan's work was now in galleries across the globe, each exhibition attended by collectors, critics, and admirers who saw the depth in his art. His fame had spread far beyond the streets he once roamed, and with that fame came the validation of his talent, something that had eluded him for so long. But it wasn't just his art that had flourished. Lorcan had found love again, with Callista by his side. Their bond had deepened over the months, both personal and professional. Callista had become not only his partner, but his greatest supporter. Together they worked on curating art shows and travelling the world, pushing boundaries in the art world. And in each moment they shared, there was an undeniable connection, a quiet understanding that they had found something rare, something real. It was at one of their most successful exhibitions that Lorcan stood before a crowd of admirers, his heart swelling with pride. Callista stood beside him, her hand gently resting on his arm, her smile matching his. "Thank you all for believing in my work," Lorcan said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "But more importantly, thank you for believing in me. The journey isn't always easy, but it's worth it when you have people who see you for who you really are." As he spoke, he couldn't help but think of how far he'd come, from the homeless man with nothing but his art to a celebrated artist surrounded by people who admired him. And of course, he thought of Celestine, the woman who had once tried to control him, but who had in the end unknowingly set him free. Meanwhile, Celestine had forged a new path for herself, one that was driven not by wealth or status, but by purpose. She had opened an art therapy centre for underprivileged youth, a place where young people could express themselves through creativity and find healing. It was a far cry from the luxurious life she once knew, but it brought her a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced before. In the centre, Celestine saw the same struggles she had once experienced, the feeling of being lost, alone, or misunderstood. She saw echoes of her own past in the eyes of the children who walked through the doors, eager to find an outlet for their pain. And every time one of them picked up a paintbrush or sculpted something from clay, Celestine knew she was doing something real, something that mattered. It wasn't long before Lorcan, who had become a close friend and colleague, began collaborating with her on art projects for the centre. Together they mentored the young artists, helping them hone their skills and share their stories. Lorcan's paintings now adorned the walls of the therapy centre, and his presence became a source of inspiration for the children who visited. For Celestine, the work was both humbling and healing. She had come to understand that true wealth was not measured by money or status, but by the impact one could have on others. And through this work, she had found something far more valuable than anything her family's fortune could offer: a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. As the years went by, Celestine and Lorcan's paths intertwined in ways neither of them had ever expected. What had started as a twisted bet and a desperate power play had transformed into a story of growth, redemption, and healing. Lorcan's art continued to inspire, his paintings speaking of the pain he had overcome and the love he had found. Callista, by his side, helped him navigate the world of art with grace and strength, supporting him every step of the way. Celestine, on the other hand, had become a beacon of hope for those who had once been forgotten. Her art therapy centre flourished, helping hundreds of young people discover their own strength and creativity. The woman who had once used her wealth to control others now used her story to empower the broken and the lost. In these moments, the themes of the story are clear: growth, forgiveness, and inner strength. Both Celestine and Lorcan had gone through unimaginable challenges, but through it all they had found the courage to change, to forgive themselves and each other, and to rebuild their lives from the ground up. Sometimes the road to redemption is long and difficult, but it's the moments of change, the quiet decisions to do better, that define us. Celestine and Lorcan have found their way, not by being perfect, but by learning to forgive, to grow, and to embrace the journey. Thank you for staying with us through this story of unexpected twists, heartfelt redemption, and the search for true love. If this journey moved you, don't forget to show your support by clicking that like button. Make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss out on more captivating stories we have in store. Your support keeps us inspired and motivated to share even more unforgettable tales with you. Until next time, keep following your heart and embrace